Hi everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this first Canberra conversation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am on the land of the Muhunina people here in Tasmania, and I acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging, pay respect to that cultural knowledge, and for my part, welcome the voice. So I've been asked to comment today on the question of democracy in Australia. And it won't come as a surprise to many of you that, having been a former leader of the Australian Greens and a current ambassador for the Global Greens, that I don't think we live in a democracy at all. For a long time, I've said that we live in a plutocracy in Australia. Hardly surprising, given that the last 40 years has been one of neoliberalism, where the whole idea of small government, deregulation, privatisation has been the way that people think about the world. Not surprising that people elected to Parliament bring that to the Parliament. But when I say plutocracy, I mean government by the representatives of the wealthy for the wealthy. They are not governing in the public interest. They are governing for the wealthy. And when I say wealthy in Australia, who am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about big property, big pharma, big defence, big fossil fuels and extractive industries, and big gambling. Predominantly, they are the people who run the federal and state parliaments of Australia. Now, as a shortcut to what I think the solution is, it's proportional representation, but we'll get to that down the track. So first thing, how do these rich people end up running the country when we have a representative democracy, when we go to elections, where we elect people who stand and undertake to act in the public interest and make a declaration to that effect? Well, it's easy, really. First of all, it's political donations. They buy elections. You can't win an election in Australia without being well funded, and that's exactly what these donors do. And what do they get in exchange? Well, they get grants or rorts in many cases. They get exemptions, like the real estate agents, lawyers, and accountants are exempted from the anti-money laundering legislation in Australia. You get tax policies delivered on your behalf, as the stage 3 tax cuts demonstrate. You get mining and extraction permits for mining, logging, gas extraction, your ships across the Great Barrier Reef, export permits, export finance, you name it. So political donations are a pretty small amount to pay for the huge amount you get in return. They also buy elections. Clive Palmer, putting his 60 million into an election as a second preference strategy, got the LNP re-elected for all of the industries that we're discussing. Clubs New South Wales knocked over Andrew Wilkie's recommendations from his inquiry into gambling many years ago federally. Julia Gillard didn't proceed. And the current New South Wales election is a case in point. In the Tasmanian state election a few years ago, the gambling industry bought that election. It was outrageous what happened in this state. And when people tried to have it investigated, it went to the Integrity Commission, and the Integrity Commission rules are so narrow, their jurisdiction so narrow, there was never ever going to be the investigation that would reveal the extent to which that election was bought. So that's how. The second thing they get is access. You give enough money, it means you get into any ministerial office anytime. You probably even have the personal phone number of the minister to give them a ring and let them know what to say or how to frame an announcement. Not only that, you have your own think tanks like the IPA, which comes up with draft legislation, which it feeds into the minister's office, its own ministers in many cases. You have a number of members of federal parliament who are former prominent people in the IPA. That legislation, those regulations are fed in. And you might ask yourself, well, surely that's the role of the public service. Surely they're putting things up to their minister. No, because John Howard and Maxwell Moore Wilton sacked 11,000 public servants when Howard took government in 96, and they then smashed the public service and privatised and outsourced a number of functions of the public service. And so in came the big four accountancy firms, Deloitte's, KPMG, etc., PwC, EY. They offered all of their services to the tax office, to every office, to facilitate business and efficiency in Australia. The public service has become a ministerial service, and robo-debt has just shown the extent to which that has happened. When you put the senior echelons of the public service onto contracts and they depend on their minister to have those contracts renewed, then of course you are going to end up with people only putting up to the minister what the minister wants to hear. So you have the minister not even being exposed to an alternative opinion or set of policy options. And then you have the lobbyists pouring in from those industries, having their meetings with the ministers, just reinforcing that idea. So it's a double layer of what would happen. They are effectively the enablers. And the next thing, of course, are the regulatory authorities. Well, surely if there are regulatory authorities whose job it is to assess whether there is compliance, whether there is enforcement or any of those things, surely they're okay? Well, no, they're not. They've got narrow jurisdictions in many cases, but just to make sure of it, the government makes all the appointments to their authorities, and so the upshot is those authorities decide what it is the government of the day wants. And an excellent example of that is the Clean Energy Regulator. They have been there to facilitate flexible baselines for the fossil fuel industry. Many of the people even on these regulatory authorities have business interests in the very industries which they then purport to regulate. So why would parliamentarians take notice necessarily of these lobbyists and big business? Well, it's a matter of re-election. They know that they need the donations next time to be re-elected. And in many cases, it's actually not the parliamentary career that they're interested in, it's the post-parliamentary career with the revolving door, where they then go and get very highly paid positions in the very industries on which they have made a legislative change or a regulation or something like that. So there is a very clear incentive to do what the industries want, and you'll be well rewarded in the long term. And there's a whole list of them who left the federal parliament and have gone on to bigger and better things with the private sector. The other thing that's been lost is the protection of whistleblowers. So people in the public service who object to what's going on, or in these regulatory authorities who know what's going on and think it's wrong, when they try and speak out, they are crushed. We have the most appalling lack of protection, I'd say, of whistleblowers in Australia. And we have seen that in the case of Julian Assange, is a classic case of someone who exposed the truth and has been penalised for exposing the truth and ostracised ever since. And don't get me started on that. Do we seriously think Albanese raised that with the Prime Minister of the UK and Joe Biden just recently, whilst he's basking in the glory of the submarines? I doubt it. But you had Bernard Collaery, you had Witness K, you have McBride, you have any number of people who are suffering at the moment because they dared to blow the whistle on what's going on in the public service. And the freedom of information laws, they were brought in order to give the public access to information to participate in our democracy, and they have been evaded deliberately, with public servants knowing that documents or messages or whatever are FOIable, and therefore they've put them on sticky notes, or they've done it as a personal phone call, or they've done it as a text to a personal phone. So they've done everything. Many people do everything in their power to avoid freedom of information, right down to blocking investigations into aspects of what has gone wrong over a long period of time. So why isn't the community screaming about this? Why aren't people up in arms about this taking over of our democracy and all its structures? Well, for the large part, they don't know about it. And that's because of the concentration of media ownership in Australia. So you only have to look at the Murdoch press to see that, and the collaboration of the Murdoch press and big business in running their particular agenda with the government of the day. And, Sky News is all over Parliament House. Well, why is Sky News the default on all those channels in every parliamentary office? Why isn't it the ABC, for example? And the ABC is another classic example of government appointments in order to destroy the ABC, just as in the UK, the Tories have done that to the BBC. And you might have read this week where they refused to screen Attenborough because he told the truth about global warming. So currently in Tasmania, for example, the government here is desperate to get Marinus Link and a whole lot of private sector energy developments up, and they're having no success with the community, who see straight through it as yet another disastrous project that will end up lining the pockets of the private sector and putting up power bills to ordinary Tasmanians. So what's happened? The government, the Liberal government with the Murdoch press, are running a whole fortnight of paid advertising, advertorials, leading to a nosh-up dinner in a couple of weeks, promoting the government's plans. So how do we shine a light on all this? How do we get our democracy back from being a plutocracy? And that's why I said the first thing is we have to make it so that the parliament is truly representative of the people and there is not a majority government. Because if it was truly representative, there would not be a majority government. There would be all sectors of society in there, and then they work out on how to negotiate government, as happens in Europe, for example. So a majority government allows all of the backroom deals to be done, all the secret deals, the cover-ups, the whole lot, and the parliament just becomes a rubber stamp. And so that's why you can block a royal commission, for example. Why hasn't there been a royal commission into East Timor? Well, because Liberal and Labor don't want it, for example. If you had a variety of voices in the parliament, you might find that things would be vastly different. So at least allowing negotiated outcomes between a whole lot of parties and independents, individuals, none of whom have absolute power, brings better outcomes. And if you go back to recent times, the most productive federal government we have had in recent memory is the Gillard government, which was a minority government with Greens and independents in balance of power. And we had a hugely successful legislative agenda, a very stable government, and delivered for the country, not for big business. But to just talk about some of the specific amendments, first of all, we have to protect the community's right to protest. That's the first thing. The community must be allowed to assemble for political purposes wherever. We must be able to protest. And I'm pleased to see the judiciary's judgment in New South Wales with Violet Coco, for example. But again, it shows how far the state has been captured by the vested interests. The fact that the police in New South Wales submitted false evidence in her trial, saying that she had held up an ambulance with flashing lights and prevented someone, obviously critically ill, getting to hospital. In the court, it was proved that that was false evidence. Now, when you get to the stage that this is happening in Australia, secret trials in the ACT, police making up evidence in New South Wales, you can see how sick our democracy has become. So we need to protect the right to protest and get rid of these anti-protest laws that have been brought in around the country. We need to change our electoral system so that we have proportional representation in the lower house. In the meantime, though, we need to have a very strong accountability framework. So the national ICAC, and it has to be a broad ICAC, not narrow jurisdiction, and it has to have some degree of retrospectivity. You can't just allow everything that's gone on in the last decade, people to get away with it. Secondly, you need a strong audit office, and it has to be well funded. It's no use setting up an ICAC and setting up a decent audit office if you don't fund it. There has to be adequate funding. and we have to have a greater capacity to have serious independent investigations like royal commissions into the scandals as they emerge. We have to block the revolving door. So we have to bring in regulations saying that you simply cannot go from a position in the parliament straight to your reward in big business, which buys them access immediately back into the political process. We have to have donations reform. We have to have truth in advertising reform. These things will mean that you can't simply put an ad on television in the course of an election campaign and spend 70 million to just drive it into the community when there is no basis in fact in that particular advertisement. We have to have a national conversation about neoliberalism. It's over for the Minister for the Environment to put up a nature repair market bill saying that we'll hand it over to the private sector because the government can't pay to protect our environment. Oh, but by the way, we can pay 360 billion for submarines. So if the market is so great, let the market pay for the submarines and let's have that 360 billion going into public health, public education, protection of the environment. The idea that markets can fix everything is wrong. Markets have failed, and we need the conversation on democracy in Australia needs to be not just on these particulars like donations reform, revolving door, strengthening regulatory agencies, independent procurement, independent appointment to boards, etc. They are all parts of implementing what we need to do. The big conversation is accept. We've lost our democracy. We are now a plutocracy. How do we get it back? Electoral reform. And how do we make sure when we do get it back that it acts in the public interest? And that is abandon neoliberalism. It is over. And if there has been a fault on the left, it is that we have not come up with the response to replacing neoliberalism in any kind of holistic way. And as a result, it lingers on in Australia longer than its use-by date. It's dead and buried and needs to be gone. One good thing that's happened in recent years is, of course, the increased numbers of Greens and independents in the parliament, and of course, the huge change at the last federal election with the Climate 200 candidates, or a group of independents otherwise referred to as the Teals. Now, I think that's been a great thing. They have brought a whole lot of new ideas to the parliament, and they've reinforced ideas coming from the community, but they've broadened that appeal through calling for things like a much stronger ICAC, calling for ending of the revolving doors, calling for people appointed to government boards being appointed on merit, and so on. So there's a whole lot of reforms that they have proposed that have been proposed for a long time but have been ignored. So it's great that they're there. It's great that they're there representing their communities, and they're bringing something of that notion of communities actually participating in their democracy back into the parliament. But in terms of how successful will they be? So the independents who've been elected in the lower house have predominantly come from Liberal-held seats. So it is in the interests of the Labor government, the Albanese government, to make sure that they are re-elected, because every independent or Teal who is re-elected keeps the coalition out of government. So clearly that is in Labor's interest to do that. And so what we've seen is Labor is in the position of being able to include the Teals, take them into their confidence and so on. But whatever the Teals do doesn't really matter to the government because they've got the numbers in the lower house. So Anthony Albanese is in the luxurious position of being able to be inclusive, but at the same time, he has also the power to take absolutely no notice, or to give just minimal amendments that look as if they might make a big difference, but don't. So for an example of that, and this goes to the state capture, is the Climate Change Authority. So when the 43% emissions reduction target went through the Parliament, the Teals secured some amendments around the Climate Change Authority being able to be the official advisory to the government on future ambition. Well, that was already in the legislation and had been in there for a long time. But at the same time as that happened, the government, Chris Bowen, did not change the membership of the Climate Change Authority. So it's currently chaired by Grant King, former Business Council of Australia, former Origin Energy gas extraordinaire, and of course the chair of Green Collar, who into providing offsets. Also on that Climate Change Authority is Susie Smith from Santos. So Chris Bowen has agreed to be advised by the Climate Change Authority, knowing full well by leaving those people on there, that Climate Change Authority will never, ever in this period of government recommend a higher target. They will not. So it's an insurance policy for the Labor Party to leave that regulatory authority there and appear to have done something good for the climate. That sort of thing is going to go on excessively in this period of government. The other thing about that is if the Labor Party neutralises the Teals in the lower house by giving them amendments which don't really change things very much but have good public relations appeal, what that does is put the legislation through the lower house and put a huge amount of pressure on the Greens and David Pocock in the Senate, because the government can then say, oh, look, we've done all these good consultations and so on. These people are just standing out and trying to be obstructionists. So just be aware that that kind of game playing is going on right now. Having said that, though, it has been a breath of fresh air to have them in there, and I'm really pleased to see how many have been successful, and I hope there are a lot more, and of course a lot more Greens. So I hope you enjoy your conversation this afternoon. I wish I was there. I cannot tell you how many hours I've spent thinking about these things over the years, but congratulations on coming together and good luck.